It wasn't that long ago that we actually spoke about fox spirits, though it was in a Chinese context, specifically in northern China, for the Chumashen episode. And now we're going back all the way to Japan to talk about some more fox-themed topics.
That we are. Definitely check out the Chumashan episode as a bit of a precursor to this one, as well as maybe even Were Tigers.
Yeah, so that's 16, The Immortal Faith in Northern China, and then number 3, The Were Tiger King. With this one, I was really wanting to touch on this for a while. It's been one of those episodes that's been in the background of like the catalog of like things to note because I find spirit possession and animal veneration and shape-shifting and animal familiars are all topics that are going to be recurring themes in the more research-heavy episodes. And since we just did a few interviews and guest features, I thought it'd be great to kind of pivot back a little bit into that realm for an episode or two before we have more people on, just as a way to get into some interesting folklore that I think might be helpful in considering notions of where medical intervention and psychiatry, comes into play versus cultural boundedness of spirit possession. So I'm really excited about this one. And Salt, I'm really excited that you're here for it because you're kind of the fox person in terms of like knowing so much about various different kinds of fox spirits in China. And I'm sure, you've come across a lot of research in Korea and Japan and other places and so on. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on Kitsune-tsuki.
Yeah, it's a really exciting episode. I mean, the exchange between all these countries together is fascinating alone, let alone when we get into the nitty-gritty of each independent country and how they view things, how things are done, and also like the cultural expectations around these, right? Because it's something that's quite often taboo or something that's seen with much caution, at least to put it kindly. So like, very exciting episode.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're here. And one thing that you'll note with this one is we're going to really talk about because the source material for Kitsune-tsuki is greatly coming out of both anthropology and psychiatric studies. We're going to have to look a lot into the actual socioeconomic upturns in Japan and what was happening in the Edo period and the Meiji Reformation era, and what actually was occurring in villages where a lot of this phenomenon was taking place in terms of the social upheaval, the different economic classes that were beginning to develop and redevelop, and also, of course, the top-down imposition of new cultural laws and stratas. So I'm really excited about this, and I welcome you all to consider. For the Patreons, they'll have all the show notes available, but definitely any of the topics that we mentioned, I highly recommend you checking it out. There's a lot of research out there on this, and this is just going to be a brief survey into it. But with that said, join us for Kitsune-tsuki, possession and fox ownership in Japan. Yokoso, minasan! Be not alarmed at the frightful howls which you may hear. It's Svinga, Salt, and Byakuki. That's the white fox key. That's what I gave you today. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us. This is going to be a real exciting treat for me personally because this is I've been learning Japanese, and so it's been really exciting to kind of delve into more and more as my kanji reading ability increases, more primary source texts. And there's quite a few that I used for this that I was able to kind of make my way through with a dictionary. But a lot of it I'm also relying on excellent secondary sources. So when it comes to this topic, if you're interested, you will not be finding a lack of resources yourself, whether it's in English or other languages, there's plenty out there. And before we dive in, I thought we'd do some housekeeping first at the beginnings of the episodes instead of at the end, which is please do give us a rating and a review on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes. It really helps us fight the demiurge of the algorithm. And remember to follow us at twitter.com/frightfulhowls to keep up to date, and support the show at patreon.com/the frightful howls. You get a bonus episode every month curated by you in the form of a Q&A, Salt's monthly astrological almanac to plan out your sorcerer's schedule, access to our live book club at the end of the month, our show notes, and much more. It's only $10 a month. There's only one tier, and it's never going to change. And we're really excited to have you join our community, especially as the book club's been getting off its feet. We get to actually meet people and interact with them, and it's just been absolutely lovely. So thank you so much. Okay, so Kitsune-tsuki. Often this term has been translated as fox possession, and this is a definition that we're actually going to explore and kind of challenge shortly. But this is usually what you hear of the actual term being described as, right? It's both this most famous type of spirit possession in Japan, as well as one of the more familiar expressions of what we might call madness within Japanese mythopoetic, religious, and medical structures of loss, grief, crisis, and communal transformation. This is a concept that has been greatly studied within both Japanese scholarship on religion and folk belief, as well as within most psychiatric journals, attempting to consider kitsune-tsuki as a kind of culturally negotiated performance of mental illness. So associations, between spirit possession and mental illness are nothing new, as we're all aware, with some scholars actually taking pains to divide spirit possession as a phenomenon into two broad categories. Executive, for example, in which the spirit displaces or eclipses the agency of the host, causing a change in bodily identity. So in this case, the spirit will be responsible for all the behavior and speech for the duration of the episode. All the agency is attributed to this new being. And pathogenic, which involves the attribution of misfortune or illness to the intrusion of a spirit into a person's body. This is the case where usually you have to have some kind of exorcism take place, divination, diagnosis, to determine what spirit is exactly haunting somebody and how to remove them. And these categories are not really meant to be kept wholly separate, even within scholarship. After all, someone in a pathogenic state of possession, of sickness, for example, might be experiencing an intrusive agent that causes a range of undesirable symptoms and behavior, while at the same time, they might be considered to be in a state of executive possession, as part of the procedure involves identifying which spirit is inside of them and causing this particular sickness to occur and bartering with them to get them to leave, right? So as we work through the material in this episode, you may find it useful to consider the tensions and limits of these definitions. Transpossession is hugely studied across anthropological disciplines, with no shortage of theories as to how to approach the topic, let alone define it. So our investigation will, as always, be an animist magical one. We are all sorcerers and witches. We are all initiated into systems of magic and spirit contact and veneration that involve possession in terms of spirits taking over bodies, speaking, requiring offerings, requiring care, and so on. So this is not something that we are skeptical of. We are all literally, we are animists and sorcerers first. So when I look at this kind of scholarship, I do want to have a critical mind, but I also want to acknowledge my own bias, where I come from in terms of as someone who's agnostic about the understanding of the why, but deeply, deeply embedded in systems of knowing how to help, right? How to actually facilitate these trance states and how to induce them. So I do find it useful to consider how this phenomena is not only interpreted by scholars, such as the people that we'll be drawing our references from, as well as medical professionals, but also how psychiatry and medicine intersect with possession. Because after all, animist traditions around the world acknowledge that spirits and magic can be the root causes of illnesses, and that treatments often require this kind of delicate approach of both naming and resolving this assailing spirit entity, while also applying medicinal relief, be it conventional or traditional. So this is something I want us to keep in mind, not to throw out either baby without the bathwater. And the reason I'm giving this preface is because the literature on kitsune-tsuki is extremely bounded in the poetics and the logics of this exact negotiation process, as I'm sure you'll soon see. With that said, let's talk about kitsune-tsuki. There's a lot of material to cover, and I'm excited to build off episode 16, as we mentioned, on Chimesian and the immortal family in northern China. As Salt had shown us, right, this is a tradition that obviously venerates fox immortals and considers other kinds of spirit foxes as part of its retinue. And just as there are foxes loyal to the gods, working as their emissaries in Japan, so too are there mischievous witch foxes and familiars that sow discord.
Yeah, for every immortal hoof, there's 100 mountain demons and 1,000 ghosts, including the ghosts of animals, for example.
Yeah, and they all behave differently and have different protocols and are seen in completely different lights. They can't be necessarily put under one broad umbrella just because they happen to all have fox characteristics.
Absolutely, yeah. There's very much a different expectation, different rules that they follow as well, right? Like norms, acceptable behaviors, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, like human spirits, right? Depending on the cultural background, depending on the level of cultivation, however you want to call it, or development, whatever it is exactly that the term is in your tradition, right? Each different human spirits require completely different approaches. So there, in that way, actually, it's a good thing to know that there are as many categories of kitsune in Japanese folklore as there are these, right? So Japanese folklorists have gone to great pains to clarify the various influences, textual sources, and regional differences between them. And this episode is not really going to be about kitsune lore as a category. That could be its own separate thing, and maybe one day it will be. We are specifically tackling the notion of fox possession and its associated accusations of curses and malefica sent by hereditary witches that keep foxes as familiars. There are so many excellent resources out there on kitsune in general, and if the ever-popular Japanese cult of the fox strikes your fancy, we'll definitely plug a few of the different resources in our show notes for the Patreon subscribers. We've mentioned that kitsune-tsuki is considered to be the best known and most common form of cultural possession in Japan, but what exactly does it entail? We have textual sources about this phenomenon from as far as the 12th century, and as we will soon see in this episode, it's been the subject of a great deal of anthropological as well as medical study, typically being constructed as a kind of culture-bounded syndrome unique to Japanese culture. Symptoms of kitsune-tsuki are extremely diverse and are not limited merely to someone behaving like or speaking as a fox, as in the case of a direct personality replacement type of possession or executive possession. Frequent night terrors, being hag-ridden, experiencing intense migraines, backaches, especially as if you're being literally ridden, wariness and feebleness, uncanny and unnatural changes in facial expressions, especially those that are understood as emulating that of a fox. These things are not necessarily considered to be pathological themselves, but when they're considered together as a whole, along with the culturally bounded meaning of fox possession, they come to fall under this pathological category. This was also, even from the outset, a vague category, with at times any strange or antisocial deviant behavior being described as the result of fox possession. Suyama's Ninko Benwakudan of 1818 describes cases of individuals who, and I'm quoting it, ate gravel, ashes, hair, or combs, wandered the mountains and fields making piles of stones, and jumped into rivers or ran into mountains, etc. Which, by the way, aside from eating the gravel, hair, and combs, this is just standard beaky behavior. But you eat you eat ashes though, and you go to gym in between all of these.
I'm pretty sure I've seen him eat a comb before as well.
I've been known to give certain types of material a taste during its construction, and jump into rivers, make piles of stones in the woods. So.
You and I actually were making a powder once together, and I had a feeling that it wasn't quite done. Like we had put all the ingredients that we had divined on inside, and it was all mixed already, and I just had this strong nagging feeling that it wasn't complete. And so I asked you, like, what do you think? Like, just something more do we gotta add? What might it be? And a spirit came in, looked at Key, and was just like, taste it. And he did, and he was like, oh, it needs this. And that was perfect. And that spirit just vanished afterwards. He came back later to prove, but it was so funny. It was just like a random moment. He was just like, try it.
Definitely. It's one for the memory books, as it were, because of how outlandish but effective the method was in that moment.
No, for real. Shout outs to tasting your powders. You've actually our friends Oils, including Mahegans, who was on the episode recently for French Canadian folklore. You've tasted his oils and given him feedback based on them.
And for this dish, we're gonna need some hot foot powder.
No.
Spicy.
Spicy. A great book I would recommend to everybody interested in Japanese folklore is Carmen Blacker's The Katalpabao, a study of shamanistic practices in Japan. She has an early chapter on witch animals, so animals associated with witchcraft, and she asks the question of why exactly would an animal like a fox want to enter human form by possession? One answer is that of urami, or malice. The fox possesses the victim in revenge for an offense, such as the killing of its cubs, or even something as simple as startling it awake from a pleasant afternoon nap.
I wouldn't diminish the crime of waking someone up from a nap. I mean, that's a pretty serious offense. But in all seriousness, you do see something similar in Xianja, actually, where they're going to ride someone as a medium because, his great-granddad kept trapping a fox or a weasel trying to get to the chickens, and something bad happens there. So Big Boss Yellow comes down 50 years later, he yells, oh, that's my descendant. How dare your granddad kill him? And it's an issue that needs resolution, right? But your granddad didn't resolve it, so now it falls on you as descendant. It's quite a typical Confucian cultural trait there, right? Like, you fuck up, so now it's on your descendant.
Well, we saw that in episode 3 on Were-Tigers, right? The way that the kind of karma, if you will, of the action falls on descendants to be resolved. And that's why they might transform into Were-Tigers or have particular issues with that.
Yeah. I mean, retribution, like karma is just way beyond the individual in Chinese culture, right? It's this ancestral influence as well.
Hmm.
Even if you use Malefica and come out completely fine, it doesn't mean your descendants will. It's kind of one of the ensuing ideas you'll see quite often.
Hmm. Yeah, another example from Blacker's book for why foxes might possess people is that of greed or desire. Especially, for example, the desire for fried bean curd and red rice, two foods that in Japan are pretty much universally known to be irresistible to foxes. So sometimes a fox may also possess a human just because it wants a shrine set up to it, and it wants offerings to be paid every day. And the only way it can like communicate this to a human who's not able to like mediumistically or psychically perceive its desire, or by like talking to them directly, is to possess them and or possess someone around them and speak with the human mouth and be like, "Hi, like I'm a fox. I want a shrine. I will help you. You will help me. This is how it's gonna be."
If only it were that straightforward sometimes, right?
Yeah, yeah, indeed. But often it is not the fox itself who chooses to possess. It is commanded to do so by a witch or a sorcerer known as a kitsune-tsukai, meaning a fox employer, or a kitsune-mochi, a fox owner, like someone who owns foxes. We will speak on these in much greater detail in the latter half of the episode, but for now we're going to discuss the phenomenon of the possession itself and ground it in this cultural and historical context from which our sources emerge. Shigeyuki Eguchi, author of the very well-known text on this matter titled Between Folk Concepts of Illness and Psychiatric Diagnosis, Kitsune-tsuki in a Mountain Village of Western Japan, proposes that the evolution of Kitsune-tsuki is one which takes place in a mythopoetic context, embedded with the ideas, beliefs, and meaning-making productions of Japanese understandings of foxes in their daily lives. After all, while kitsune-tsuki can occur in urban settings, it is far more frequently encountered in rural and mountain villages, which bear social settings far more conducive to spiritual practices and explanations. Not only is it easier to encounter a real fox in these settings, but their animal forms are linked to classes of spirits and kami that are venerated in the countryside, as well as to characters in children's folktales. Much in the same way as the cult of Inari grew in the 17th century, with Inari being the god of the harvest most famously depicted in fox form, so too did recorded instances of kitsune-tsuki. Eguchi has this to say about the Edo period's treatment.
Treatment of such cases was always left to religious figures and came to consist of a religious ritual called kajikito, intended to remove the fox from the afflicted person's body. The ritual involved incantation as well as various physical measures, such as enveloping the person in smoke, beating, and so on. When the fox was judged to have left the person's body, it was then carefully enshrined and made into an object of reverence.
So here you have when, the spirit leaves, it's still enshrined into an object or some kind of panel or plaque, usually, some kind of idol, and then it's venerated and kind of kept nonetheless.
Yeah, I think the relationship of space here is pretty noteworthy, right? Like, there has to be a space for it outside of the body. Like, you need to make that for it. I think that kind of plays into the notion of possession as quite a bodily effect, right?
Yeah, I mean, even in various African traditional religions that seat spirits, that have a vessel for the spirit to live in, it's usually constructed as now you have two bodies, right? You have a body to ride, which is your mount, it's your initiate, and you have a body to live in, so that you don't always have to be riding the person. So people sometimes seat their spirits because they're getting possessed too often, because they need the spirit to have a place to go to that is not them.
It makes a lot of sense. Like, it's fascinating how these kind of things just everywhere, you know?
Absolutely.
It's also very fascinating how in this particular procedure they note that like beating can be a feature of it. So making the one body so inhabitable that it must leave and go somewhere much nicer, like the carefully constructed net is always pretty interesting.
Yeah, Eguchi's study is really worth reading, and actually quite a few of our sources cite Eguchi specifically. It goes into two case histories from the same area of Western Japan, one dealing with aspects of psychosis and the other of neurosis, respectively. Eguchi draws on both clinical psychiatric records and ethnographic reports to consider the interaction between patients and people as Kitsune-tsuki unfolds as like a drama around them, and ways in which both the person possessed and the villagers who considered him possessed play into its development, categorization, and ultimate treatment. We're going to circle back to his work and notably some of his studies in a little bit, but for now, let's talk about the medicalization of this phenomena, as it's really the elephant in the room that can't go unaddressed. For the discussion of the medicalization of Kitsune-tsuki, I'd like to start with a quote from H. Yumi Kim's book, Madness in the Family. This is from page 26, which is the opening of her chapter, Fox Spirits in Villages.
In 1882, in the town of Kita Adachi, In Saitama Prefecture, a relatively well-to-do farmer named Kazuyo Yujiro discovered that all 5 members of his family had gone mad. His wife and children burst into uncontrollable fits of laughter one moment, only to fly into a rage the next, as if stricken by some unknown force. This is no small matter, thought Kazuyo. If I don't get help, my family will be overcome by madness. Believing that the cause might be a curse of the local protector deity, Kazuyo rushed to the nearby shrine to seek advice from the priest. The priest consulted the gods and identified the cause of the strange behavior with uncanny precision. It was most certainly Tanaka Ichigoro, the leader of a rival religious group associated with Mount Mitake, which had unleashed a fox spirit on the Kazuyo family to bewitch them into a frenzy. The revelation infuriated not only Kazuyo, but the young man of Kita Adachi. How dare this Ichigoro send a fox spirit to torment the people of their town? Wrapping towels around their foreheads and raising their hose into the air, they shouted for Tanaka's head. Before the violence escalated, an elder of Kita Adachi warned that the gods would not forgive an uprising, and suggested instead that the men file a complaint with the police. The men put their accusation in writing and submitted a petition at the police headquarters in nearby Soka. The police dismissed the petition with disdain, declaring that there was no such thing as fox spirits overtaking the minds and bodies of people, and that the Kazuyo family was simply ill. The Soka police headquarters dispatched one of its men to find a doctor and accompany him to the Kazuyo residence, where he treated the family and, lo and behold, cured them of their madness. Only then did the men of Kita Adachi take to heart the words of the police.
This is a really fascinating story. I was immediately struck with it. It's the opening of her chapter.
It's fantastically politically moralizing as well.
Precisely. That's something we're going to go into with quite a lot of detail now, because Kim notes that on the first pass, the story seems to, and I'm quoting her directly, affirm the stance of early Meiji leaders that commoners ought to be disabused of so-called superstitions that hampered efforts to civilize and enlighten the nation in the face of European and American imperialist aggression in the late 19th century. The story was actually published in one of the first national Japanese newspapers and was used by Meiji reformers to blame wayward folk beliefs as superstitious, backwards, and ultimately causing unnecessary social upheaval in their attempts to restructure the relationship between what counted as real religion as a part of this nationalist state-building exercise and what was to be cast out entirely. Yet there's so much more to this episode than there seems at first glance. The reporter of the story actually reveals how Kazuyo faced this array of clashing claims about the cause of his family's strange behavior, as well as the proper authorities with whom he ought to consult. The case highlights intra-religious competition and conflict, which became all the more prevalent through the newly created Meiji policies that pit religious groups against each other for prevalence and state recognition, as a source of diverse sets of authority alongside the ultimate conclusion were reached. Kim notes that the time period in which this story takes place is one in which Meiji government officials and psychiatrists attempted to establish their authorities in a way that undermined pre-existing family and village-centered structures and cultures of religious and spiritual care for those that are considered mad. Despite these efforts to redefine Kitsune-tsuki as a superstition and a mental illness, the term still had enormous sway into the early 20th century. Kim helpfully points out that while the term is usually translated as fox possession in English, as we've used so far in this episode, it more precisely means fox spirit attachment. The literal meaning of tsuku, the Japanese verb from which tsuki derives, is a kind of contact between two surfaces, a fox spirit and human. In other words, this is a kind of spatial adherence, not necessarily a deep and penetrating form of control and ownership, which is often suggested by possession. The next quote comes to us directly about this phenomenon as well.
Edo period families speculated about the cause or nature of a member's madness, often with the input of fellow villagers and acquaintances. Most commonly, people use such terms as kichigai and rankai for madness, invoking the widespread philosophical and medical notion of chi, or ki, I guess in Japanese, sorry, a invisible and intangible life force. Ki constituted the flow of energy that circulated both within the body and between the body and the environment. During its circulation through and between living things, Ki could become or be changed through a range of social, affective, material, or natural forces as interpersonal relations, emotions, or wind and cold. Ki might surge in anger, drown away in sorrow, or become knotted when exercising caution. It was considered a significant determinant of health and illness, with disruptions in its smooth flow seen as a potential cause of bodily and psychological suffering. The term kitsune-tsukai first suggested that the flow of ki had become altered or different, and is still used today as a colloquial expression to describe strange behavior. Similarly, rankai described ki as having been disordered. Other analogous terms for madness included ranchen, disordered heart, and joki, or elevated ki, as recorded in Edo period documents composed by village headsmen, city magistrates, and other officials compelled to identify cases of madness when executing punishments for crimes, or granting permission for home confinement.
Something that's important to note here, actually, in terms of this understanding of madness is caused by ki disturbances, was that there's a lot of growing Sino-Japanese medical literature on this topic in the 18th century. So Japanese physicians were trained in kanpo, meaning Chinese method of medicine, increasingly identified the causes of psychological disorder in the stagnation of ki in such organs of the body as the heart, stomach, and liver. So you might have kanpo physicians that propose that blockages of ki in the liver, for example, affected one's emotional and mental states. Although kan was associated with convulsions and seizures in medical literature, it was also popularized in the expression kanshou, meaning either kan nature or kan symptoms, to describe people who were anxious, fastidious, or obsessed with cleanliness, or were pompous. Since kan is also a homonym for liver, kanshou can at times be written as liver symptoms. And foxes weren't the only beings blamed for these kinds of symptoms. Deities, ghosts, tanuki, the raccoon dogs, dog spirits known as inugami, cats, and snakes were all said to be capable of attaching themselves, right, this tsuki, attaching themselves to their hosts for reasons ranging between mischievous pranks and exacting revenge. So Kim notes that, when families, neighbors, and even passerbys heard that an afflicted person was asking for red bean rice or tofu, foods thought to be favored by foxes, or recall that the person had recently visited the shrine and worshipped Inari, a deity for which this shape-shifting fox was a symbol, they might suggest that the fox spirit had actually attached itself to the person and triggered this mad behavior. Similarly, ritual specialists, including Buddhist priests, mountain ascetics such as the Yamabushi or Shugenja, followers of the syncretic Shugendo tradition, as well as itinerant priests and holy men, were consulted for how to remove and exorcise them. It is important to state here that many Buddhist priests had been educated in medicinal sources since at least the medieval period. Kim actually notes that temples often sold their own proprietary medicine made out of herbs, as did itinerant priests associated with famous holy sites. So there was a whole economy here at play, as well as the training method. As there was no institutionalized hierarchy of healers in place during the Edo period, individuals suffering from various illnesses did not necessarily grant that a doctor educated in Sino-Japanese medicine, the kanpo, were more legitimate than a spiritual healer. And indeed, even as some of these kanpo doctors tried to distinguish themselves from purely spiritual and magical cures, they still diagnosed kitsune-tsuki as a cause, such as in the case that we'll see here.
When kanpo physician Nakagami Kinkei was hired by a family of a 16-year-old girl who was waking up in the middle of the night and dancing until sunrise, he agreed with her parents' assessment that a fox spirit had attached itself to her, for which he prescribed herbal sedatives. In this case, as well as in others, families readily hired one healer after another until they found an effective treatment. Kanpo doctor Kitamura Ryotaku was one among many healers hired by a family of a woman who showed signs of madness after visiting a famous Inari shrine at the edges of Edo City. She sung loudly, talked incoherently, and claimed that she could read minds. Those around her believed that a fox spirit had attached itself to her, likely because she had visited an Inari shrine, which was, of course, associated with foxes. Kitamura made note of all the healers who had been summoned before him: a monk who chanted a sutra, a doctor who tried to expel the fox spirit from her body by burning incense, a warrior who attempted to scare the fox spirit away with a bow and arrow, and a doctor who boiled farewell money, or senbetsu, to persuade the fox to be on its way, and then gave her the infusion to drink. Even Kitamura invoked common parlance, referring to the healers who burned incense and boiled farewell money as doctors, which at the time included what one might now conventionally call a religious or spiritual healer. The reference to the warrior also confirms that families did not exclusively turn to those who specialized in healing to treat fox spirit attachment. Members of the warrior class, Wuxi, for instance, were summoned to frighten off fox spirits with their weapons. Indeed, families called upon neighbors, relatives, siblings, local officials, and others who had no special training but would try to persuade and reprimand the fox spirit to leave the afflicted person's body.
It's kind of sitcom-like, the amount of people who are trying to scare this being out. Also, you're Byakuki today, but you could also be Bushiki, waving the bow and arrow at the person
yeah.
to try and get the fox to leave.
It sounds remarkably effective in comparison to some of these other things as well.
Yeah, you guys gotta spook them sometimes. I mean, I like it. I do also like that this is very, yeah, it's very sitcom-y. There's just so many people in a row. It's kind of like the scene in Airplane where they're trying to slap the woman out of her hysteria. Yeah.
I mean, just imagine we bring in the local county magistrate and he's like, okay, so if you're going to stay in this body, we need to talk about the tax.
Yeah, yeah. You gotta pay taxes too, not just the body.
It's good. It's very Seinfeldian.
Indeed. We keep mentioning the Meiji government and its reforms. So this was the period between 1868 and 1912 that in many ways modernized and indeed westernized Japan. Just as reformers toppled the previous Tokugawa regime, so too did they attempt to topple folk beliefs and systemize ideas of Japanese religion in order to reestablish a notion of purity. And as we all know from our studies of various different kinds of attempts to do this, this never quite works out the way you intended to. And there's no such thing really as an original purity when every single country in the world has a vast, array of different practices and beliefs that are incredibly localized. So the Meiji Emperor was elevated to a place of divinity. Beliefs deemed to be foreign were purged. Buddhist and Shinto syncretisms were artificially divided despite living in harmony and being appropriating one and the other mutually. And certain more popular kami were elevated over allegedly foreign Buddhas derived from Indian and Chinese belief systems, as I'm quoting the paper. It must be noted here that the kami which were syncretized with certain bodhisattvas, as well as more local idiosyncratic kami, were subject to their own, quote, purification of foreign elements, or outright sublimation. The worship of kami came to be imposed as an official Japanese state religion of Shinto over and above Buddhism, which was seen as foreign. Which is kind of ironic given how much both of these traditions have influenced Japanese aesthetics, but this is, the westernizing attempt, right, is also to come across to the challenges of increasing contact with the rest of the world. And this, of course, meant that syncretic religious traditions were outright suppressed. Edicts singled out the Yamabushi, the followers of Shugendo, whose magic exorcisms and prayers and healing services were often relied upon by those looking for relief from phenomena like Kitsune-tsuki. Shugendo was actually outlawed in 1872 by the Dajokan, or council state, which forced the Yamabushi to join other Buddhist orders in order to keep their priestless status. Kim says that Catalpa diviners, Asusamiko, female mediums, Ichiko, and those who practice spirit possession rituals, Hyokito, fox summoning, kitsune-sage, coin divination and spirit speaking, kuchiyose, because they allegedly bedazzled and the general populace, leading them to astray and often swindling them. Prohibitions against healing rituals soon followed. In 1874, former practitioners of Shugendo were prohibited from renting accommodations in towns and calling them temples. They also could not use the title Shugenja or don Shugendo robes. Again, if they wanted to remain a priest, they had to now ordain in a different Buddhist order in order to keep their status. And this project of legitimizing the Meiji state's power over what is and what is not authentic Japanese religion was also intertwined with another political goal, which is establishing a centralized medical and public healthcare system. The spread of syphilis and cholera in Japan after its ports were made open to trade with the United States and Europe alarmed these reformers, who responded with their modernizing sweep by elevating Western medicine over Sino-Japanese and folk traditions, and widely recruited physicians trained in Dutch medical schools. Importantly for our investigation to note here is that academic psychiatry was now established in these burgeoning Japanese medical schools, born of the Western model. Kitsune-tsuki symptoms were redefined as Seishinbyo, the literal Japanese translation of the German word Geisteskrankheit, or sickness in spirit. Both are commonly translated into English as mental disease or mental illness. Eguchi notes on page 423.
Morita included fox and inugami possession in his compendium of cases of what he called invocation psychosis, or kitose seishinbyo, arising from kaji kito. From the fact he had to create this new term for classification, it can be seen that the traditional folk view of illness had remained strong even after the Meiji Restoration. In 1902, Kadawaki, a psychiatrist, examined 113 cases of kitsune-tsuki in patients hospitalized in the Sagama Mental Hospital in Tokyo. According to the German classification for psychopathology in use at the time, he classified all the cases as mania, paranoia, hysteria, etc. And a designation, kitsune-tsuki, was withdrawn as an unscientific superstition. However, today, almost 90 years later, cases of possession still occur. Along with our best-known fox and snake possession, we hear of animal possession specific to various regions, badger, dog, cat, and so on, and also of other variants of spirit possession. Kitsune-tsuki was not limited to rural areas, but is in fact encountered in clinical psychiatric settings in large urban areas. At least until right after the war, the expression kitsune-tsuki often appeared in daily conversation, for instance in such comments as, "Why are you eating so much all of a sudden? Has a fox possessed you?" And a belief seemed to have remained alive in all parts of daily life.
If you remember, I mentioned that in Eguchi's paper, he has these 3 excellent case studies that I highly recommend everyone to read. We don't have time to go over all 3, but I thought we might as well include the first one, which is particularly, I think, evocative. Although the third one I was really tempted to include as well because it includes a woman who gets possessed in various forms. The possession is reinterpreted as her having the ability to be a priest for a particular deity, and then later on, when that doesn't work out, it suddenly becomes the possession by a Buddhist spirit. So it kind of shows that there's an economic drive to say which spirit you're being possessed by. At some point, people interpret as a fox, and so on and so forth. And like the whole shrine, there's a lot of drama in that story, which I just want to flag that it's really interesting to go into. But the one that we're going to read right now is the case of Takao, which Key, I would have you read.
Takao is an 18-year-old factory worker, the eldest of 3 brothers in a carpenter's family. He was first seen in 1978, and from that time to the present has been hospitalized 4 or 5 times. At the time of first examination, he was brought to the hospital tied hand and foot, accompanied in the car by 5 or 6 people, family members and a local public health worker. He was of sturdy, muscular build and wore 4 layers of dirty shirts. When the ropes binding him were removed, he jumped onto a chair in a karate stance and hopped around the room in an excited manner, muttering to himself. His family reported that he had been involved in a traffic accident about 1 month previously, and during the subsequent examination at the police station, he had started imitating a fox, jumping onto the table and shouting. The startled police officer had said, "Are you an Inari believer?" and sent him home. As he was being driven home by his mother, he suddenly bit her in the arm, and even after he arrived home, his state of excitement continued. It was not until he was found some days later walking the narrow streets of the village, brandishing a huge sickle, and dressed in a work raincoat and helmet with a towel wrapped around his neck, that his family tied him up and brought him to the hospital. Some had suggested that he was possessed by a powerful god, and that they should leave him alone for some time and see what happened. He had been left tied to a pillar in a storehouse. Representatives of various religious sects had tried to exorcise what was possessing him, but without effect. It was the district welfare officer who, concerned for Takao's increasingly weakened state, had suggested that he be brought for examination. After he was hospitalized, he remained in a state of excitement and was placed in a padded cell. There, for some time, he was unapproachable. He tore up the bedding and his own clothing and stuffed it into the toilet, took apart the metal bed frame and used it to pound the walls, imitated karate kicks, and jumped up and down. He was suspicious of hospital personnel, saying someone is controlling the doctors. He was judged to be in an acute psychotic state and was prescribed a relatively large dose of a major tranquilizer. The prognosis of his illness was expected to be benign, so therapeutic efforts, such as medication, interview, and so forth, were focused on sedation and on helping him readapt smoothly to the circumstances. His state of exaggerated excitement lasted for approximately 1 month and then finally subsided. After graduation from high school, Takao had wanted to go live in a big city. However, he was destined to carry on his father's carpentry business, and so he went to work in a small factory some distance from his own village. His family was a devout one, and Takao himself had, for instance, immediately taken his newly purchased car to the local shrine for ritual purification. He was a hard worker, but was also quite sociable and often went with friends to discos in Kyoto and other prefectures several hours away by car. Takao himself reports.
Starting about 2 months before I came to the hospital, I was having trouble sleeping. I couldn't concentrate on my work, and I was thinking about changing jobs. I consulted a diviner about it. I had always had the ability to foretell the future, and I felt that the characters of TV dramas were copying me, or that if I got close to the TV set, I could get inside. In fact, I felt electric waves telling me, come in. One day, when I hadn't had enough sleep and was hurrying to a date with my gas gauge almost empty, I turned into the wrong road and just kept going. Then I saw a man standing out by the roadside, surrounded by a pale light. Just as I thought, it's a god. I ran through a red light and crashed head-on into another car. That happened at an intersection in downtown Osaka. The car was demolished. I ran down a man, and the driver of the other car had to have 3 stitches. I don't remember what happened after the police picked me up. After I got back to the village, I didn't feel well, and I asked him to pray for me at the shrine, but it didn't get any better. When I consulted the Kurama, he said, this is a case of Kusuhara disease, in which a fox possesses a person who is upset. My illness was caused by having seen a fox, and I became controlled by it. I've always been afraid when I heard the foxes barking up the mountains.
Takao finally recovered after having been hospitalized for 3 months. His illness was diagnosed as atypical psychosis. During brief visits home, in the course of his hospitalization, he was apparently taken by his family to consult religious practitioners on several occasions. He also told me later that when he was finally released from the hospital, his whole family went to give thanks at a local shrine, the Daishido.
There's so much we could say about this case. I was immediately struck by it when I read it at one on the medical treatment that he received and spiritual treatment that he received as being completely reconciled by his family. Like they give thanks after he was released from the hospital as that being part of successful treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And this glowing man that he felt was a kami, right, that he interpreted that as a fox that had adhered to him when he seduced him onto the road, essentially, and then leapt onto him. And yet, at the same time, we see that he's kind of had this history of these particular psychoses, right, like hearing voices in the TV telling him to enter, and so on. I definitely find that it's interesting that, kitsune possession does involve elements of divination ability and seeing the future and so on. But that also is, of course, as they're saying here, was something that the doctors took into account as part of the history of this for him.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to see how they reconcile and pathologize his particular presentation of psychosis as well. By, if we've all seen kind of the videos of possessions in like kind of Southern and Southeast Asian temples where people are, very famously imitating karate kicks, jumping up and down, going on the walls, very famous in Sakya mass empowerment rituals.
Yeah.
So, it's the context in which this is occurring, the behavior is kind of the same. The understanding of what's happening is radically differentiated both along, sectarian lines and medical lines, which I'm sure, becomes a episode unto itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And as psychiatrists became increasingly determined to catalog fox possession phenomena, even pretending to be or presenting themselves as ethnographers, anthropologists of cultures in the villages in which they conducted their fieldwork, they continually encountered this huge degree of diversity between beliefs, right? This was even reflected in the language. So, for example, kitsune is standard, but in southern Kyushu it was known as yako, field fox, and the Kanto region, osaki. In present-day Shizuoka, Nagano, and Yamanashi prefectures, the fox was given the name Kuda, the pipe fox. Under the name of Izuna, it covered much of the Tohoku district, and as Gedo, meaning literally a Buddhist heresy, it appeared in the old province of Bingo in Hiroshima prefecture. Foxes that roamed the ancient lands of Izumo and in present-day Shimane prefecture were known in local lore as a ninko, or hitogitsune, which literally means human fox. So these psychiatrists were going out from this like Meiji period into these villages and presenting themselves as ethnographers interested in cataloging folklore. And really, they were looking to understand symptoms of fox possession as something that was seen as superstition that was essentially being falsely applied to cases of mental illness that they could cure using these new methods, and which were frankly a kind of embarrassing holdover of a kind of pre-modern past. They wanted to stamp out and enlighten and civilize these areas so they could finally see them as more presentable. And Indeed, I think this is interesting because as you'll see, this is not only not exactly how things happened, but is also a classic case of what happens even when there are huge overlaps between how traditional medicine, Western medicine, modern innovations, as well as spiritual healing can all help a person. Indeed, in Takao's case, it seems like there was a lot of these different situations that were helping him. Across many villages, right? We have this situation where people are very happy to adopt. You'll even see cases where people are excited to adopt Western medicine, or an explanation that you're not possessed by a fox, you have this psychosis, because they're like, okay, great, now I don't have to pay exorbitant ritual fees at these shrines to get this removed from me. I'm happy with that explanation. I'm not like married to the idea that it's a fox possession. If it's something else, that's great. In other cases, people are not actually getting the help they need in this way, but and seem to on the other hand, be preyed upon by both people who are interested in examining their symptoms to shame them for them, and also people who are exploiting them by through snake oil salesman stuff, which is always interesting, right? Because on the one hand, we've all seen cases of miraculous cures of things, and we've all seen spirit possession that can be extremely harmful and can cause extremely bad physical symptoms that are then genuinely cured by the expulsion of the spirit. And we all have thousands of cases of exorcists of various traditions, right, taking matters into their own hands and essentially abusing people who are suffering in very real ways. And who are we to say, what exactly the origin of that is? I think we should be extremely mindful of the situation, to have a lot of charity and compassion and understanding in how what matters is that people are doing better, right? It doesn't really matter how they arrive in that place as long as it's done so with their compassion, with their agency in mind. So it's one of those things that, like, if someone is helped by an exorcism, great. But if someone really just needs medication, then absolutely, it's not a situation that someone should be married to the understanding of like what is actually happening. That's an effort that actually kills the diversity of these traditions, and also is a directly colonializing force, which can even happen within a country, right?
Definitely, yeah. Like this whole idea of modernization, I suppose, within the Meiji period is, of course, the kind of repression of the kind of more rural or traditional beliefs by the externalized modernizing force of the cities and like kind of the urban population centers.
Which is ironic, really, because it's one of those things that you see all the time, and this happens in every country, right? It's certainly happened in the former Yugoslavia, where you have this attempt to, like, let's create the real tradition, like the real nationalist project, find the real essence that is ancient and perennial and enduring. And in this project, you literally flatten everything that is unique about the diversity of your cultures, right? You literally kill authentic indigenous cultures by trying to replace them with this idea of like what is universal and what was always there. So this is all nationalisms in effect are equally ridiculous in their myth making. It's just that the ones that have been around longer seem more plausible to us, or the ones that are brand new, because you can see the remaking of history right before your eyes seem like less probable. But ultimately, I don't know, this is something that comes up a lot in politics, but I think it's worth noting here that, again, ultimately, this is a wide range of phenomena that was being cataloged, and on the one hand, it's not like it didn't help people that they were able to have access to different kinds of medications that, for the phenomena that was blamed on fox possession, that may have originated in other reasons. At the same time, it was also definitely fox possession was seen as an embarrassing thing that was done by people who were entirely too superstitious to consider other alternatives. So it's a bit of column A and a bit of column B in terms of it, right? We want to appreciate that nuance. It's just also important to note this was a nationalizing project that had a very particular agenda. So across many villages, we mentioned before, right, the phenomenon of kitsune-mochi was encountered. This is often translated as fox holding or fox owning. It was alleged that certain families were in possession of foxes as familiars, which they wielded to inflict harm upon their neighbors. And of course, this is a very typical charge we've seen levied in many witchcraft accusations globally, right? Owning a book of St. Cyprian in Portugal, or being a werewolf because you were wealthier, because you had more resources, because your cows didn't die and other people's cows died to a disease that sweeps your village, right? These are all things that can get someone accused of witchcraft, right? In the Shrat episode, we mentioned Drache and Shrat, owning or having possession of one of these familiars as someone that brings you luck and brings you the wealth of other people, is immediately that accusation is immediately levied upon people that in the social dynamics of the village are prone to being targets of jealousy. And that's exactly what we're about to see here.
According to an account written in 1809 by a village headman named Yamane Yeoman, a wealthy farmer from eastern Onshu district, a century prior, began to incur the resentment of his tenant farmers for levying heavy tributary taxes. One day, when a member of the wealthy farmer's family fell sick, one of the tenant farmers spread the rumor that a fox spirit had attached itself to the patient. The patient then started to act as if he were a fox, asking for tofu and red bean rice. The rumor soon spread that the certain families owed their wealth and good fortune to the powerful foxes that they owned. Foxes, after all, were known to be wily figures of deception. In this way, the fox acquired new symbolic meaning and uses as an instrument of village level ostracization against those accused of fox ownership.
Who is this tenant farmer that hyperstitioned a fox onto a person?
It is a kind of hyperstition. I mean, a lot of magic is. Yeah, don't tell the people at CCRU that.
Definitely not. But it's almost a funny form of the eye in some ways.
Yeah. I did think about the evil eye in this case, right? It's just it's interesting. I even was talking about this with a Japanese friend of mine who was saying sometimes the fox possession phenomena accusations in other cultures wouldn't necessarily indicate the person's being possessed by, let's say, a fairy or a kind of demon or some kind of ghoul. It might just be someone who got hit by the evil eye. But that's one of those things with this term meaning everything and retrocausally being attributed to foxes specifically. And as we'll see, not necessarily just foxes, but certainly they're one of the most common animals. You get this spreading everywhere, right? In southwestern regions of Japan, accusations of fox ownership from the, I would say, 18th century onward were connected to the economic and social transformations of this late Edo period, right before the Meiji Restoration. So Kim observes how this new burgeoning network of commerce, trade, and culture integrated both urban and rural economies in ways that fueled this new class of peasant landlords. So you had these various merchants, landowners, and moneylenders who were able to accumulate a lot of wealth by taking advantage of these new markets, amassing large plots of land that were distributed among smallholders and tenant farmers. And this all resulted in this even greater and more dramatic disparity between the rich and the poor, stoking resentment between this enormous population of landless tenants and laborers and between them and really this landlord class who exploited their conditions. And it is from this growing emerging class of peasant landlords that we find the majority of the families accused of owning foxes in the Edo period. Hayami Yasutaka, who studied his own family's subjugation to accusations of fox ownership since the early 1700s, begins his book by observing how the Hayami family had been these prominent titled peasants of Kanbara village whose elevated social status was derived from family pedigree and support from feudal authorities in the 16th century. However, his family's luck had run out by the end of the 17th century. Suddenly, a family of moneylenders who had risen from obscurity just outside the village swept in and assumed his family's surname, the Hayami family name, by legal adoption. The new Hayamis sought to revive the older family's status in village leadership, but they were opposed by the other peasant clans in Kanbara. The conflict that resulted from their attempts to reintegrate their name into the governing structure of the village resulted in the Hayamis becoming labeled as fox owners and expelled forever from leadership positions. Hayami Yasutaka's book, written in 1953, was called Tsuki-mochi Meishin no Rekishiteki Kousatsu, observes how within the Izumo district in which he lived, 10% of the families, that's a whopping 10%, bore the stigma of being fox owning as late as 1952.
That is so profoundly similar to some of the Draka lore that we had previously discussed, where and even for the same motivations of previously rigid, but now kind of a more fluid and emerging titled peasantry and merchant class, and the fortune that begot, was just this motivation for being like, oh, clearly they're good at money magic. They must have the spirit that can do it.
Yeah, exactly. I've been saying this for a while in private, but let's put on the air so that it's actually a commitment. You and I are going to do a Drache episode because I want to bring in a lot of that lore, how it's spread from various parts in the Balkans and melded with existing German understandings of dragons and how it made into that whole thing of having this dragon spirit that, steals your farmer's next door farmer's wealth and brings it to you and how you get accused of owning one. Yeah, it's such a fascinating cultural overlap across places. Because we have this as well in Serbia, right? We have this Mijaču Vrkuća, the guardian house serpent that steals the milk from your neighbor's cow and puts it in your cow, and you're accused of owning one and deploying your serpent familiar if you are someone who's doing pretty well.
Definitely. Like like you mentioned, just the amount of overlap in all of these. Of course, we've seen the scholarship of like the importation of some of the Dracula lore from Eastern Europe to Germany, but like to see it arising almost in identical ways in Japan, especially with the earlier note that snake spirits could also be attributed as the causative agents of these possessions, is something to investigate. So yeah, we'll look into that for later.
You got it. Hayami felt that the stigma against nouveau riche landlords, brought about by jealous slander from older inhabitants in villages that found themselves ousted and impoverished by newcomers, was also actually exacerbated by Shingon Buddhist priests, Shugendo Yamabushi, and other exorcists who could really make a lot of money off these cases by then investigating these families and attempting to, like, they would hire them to get rid of their own stigma by proving they weren't fox owners, or other people would call them to purify the village and so on. Kim notes from this example that accusations of fox ownership therefore served as a powerful weapon wielded by older, often impoverished founding families to protect what remained of their social status and political power in the face of the incursions of these new, wealthy families that were very upwardly mobile, moving into villages and climbing the social ladder. If you were accused of fox ownership, you were stigmatized to the point of being disqualified for leadership and shunned by others, not wanting to label themselves as fox owners themselves simply by contagion, simply by sleeping in your house, in your guest bedroom, simply by being around you or intermarrying with you. This porous nature, the stickiness and a glue-like nature, right, of the way that these fox spirits adhere to each other was something that unfortunately was so penalizing, right, that once this accusation was levied against you, there was very little you could do about it. And these accusations could even persist beyond death. In the village of Ikeda in the Tokushima prefecture, a 60-year-old widow was said to have been attacked by two different Inugami-owning families who had set their dog spirits upon her.
The first family had borrowed money from the woman's husband when he was alive, but when she later demanded repayment of the loan, the family had threatened to unleash their dog spirit on her. The second family had once sold firewood to another family, a deal for which the woman's husband had been the mediator. As the mediator, her late husband had agreed to pay for the firewood, but he neither had the full amount of 6 yen, nor could he pay interest. When he begged the family selling firewood to refrain from charging interest, they refused, and even threatened to sue if he did not eventually pay the full amount plus interest. Since the husband had paid only 2 yen of the debt before passing away, the woman afflicted with the dog spirit believed that the family had used one of their own dog spirits to torment her. The woman believed her husband's past misdeeds were coming to haunt her in the form of animal spirits. In the afflicted woman's account of the second family, the dog spirit speaking through her painted a distinctly sympathetic picture of the late husband, who had acted in a generous spirit to help his neighbor. The objects of resentment were the two dog spirit-owning families, one of whom refused to pay a debt and the other who refused to forgive a 4 yen debt, both arguably breaches of neighborly duty and mutual obligation. Villagers like this afflicted woman invoked fox ownership and attachment to accuse others of unacceptable behavior.
Shout out to episode 2, An Exorcism in Antiquity, where you told the story of the dog factory.
Oh yeah. I was just about to say shout out to dog spirit owning families and their willingness to repay debts as soon as possible, lest this occur.
Shout outs to every single person who bought our Master of the Wolves charms and inherited those wolf familiars, and now have pretty intense obligations to them in terms of keeping their oaths, but also are able to deploy them. Some things are truly universal.
Oh yeah.
One thing I think it's important to mention about animal spirit owning families is that their status, whether it's self-proclaimed hereditary witches sharing familiars or as victims of socioeconomic slander, all of these things were also bounded in the Meiji reforms. Because beginning in the 1870s, Meiji legal scholars and government bureaucrats were interested in promoting a new structure of systematically organizing family and kinship ties through what was known as the Ie system, which reinforced patrilineal inheritance and primogeniture. Yet in the Shimane and Tokushima prefectures, ownership of fox and dog spirits were a hereditary association passed down matrilineally and through marriage by women. So fears that marrying a woman from a fox-owning family would involve her foxes essentially moving in with you, becoming smuggled into your own family, to my mind, is really part of a long tradition of contagion fears about witchcraft. And familial witchcraft marriages involving the subjugation and subterfuge of the other non-witch family by the one that they're marrying into. So, as a, I guess as people who do witchcraft and sorcery, yeah, contagion is a real thing, right? Like it's absolutely true. And having ancestors become, intertwined through marriage is absolutely a thing if you know what you're doing, that can pass on familiars in a very positive way to each other, right? But in this case, I like the idea that it's, even in my country, we have the exact same thing of like, yeah, if you marry into a witch family, they can sneak all the familiars into your life and have them essentially puppet you. Right? Even switch out pieces of your souls when you're sleeping in the marriage bed and turn your personality. So I totally get this. Like it's horrible if you're accused by this, but I'd also, as like a witch, totally understand where this is coming from and the logics of it. I do think it's interesting to note, though, that again, these are spirits that are typically passed down the women line. So, and it's not just an accusation, right? There is also folklore and phenomena of these families absolutely intentionally cultivating relationships with spirit familiars and passing them on. But in this case, it's also essentially a way to slander somebody because you're envious of their resources or because you don't particularly want to do any more business dealings with them and you want to cheat them out of a good deal. So, you take on their money and then when you don't want to repay them, you just say, well, you have a dog spirit. Like, why should I do this? Like, I don't want to be in contact with you because of the contagion. Kim also helpfully observes how this stigma affected not only the individual household into which a woman married, but also the extended family of which it was part, so that any man who married a woman from a fox-owning family was usually disinherited from his own extended family. So I don't know, when I read that, all I could think of was it's interesting how, on the one hand, this punishes these clans from ever being able to kind of reproduce. It's very hard for them to wash off the stigma and be able to kind of continue their lineage. And on the other hand, it basically exercises the person who from your family who wants to marry into them by saying like we don't want the contagion from you, so we're banishing you essentially, which is a very, very harsh punishment. And I imagine led to more than one Romeo and Juliet situation. I would actually watch the fuck out of like a story in which like there's a guy who's in love with a woman who's like a witch who recently inherited a fox from her mother or something like that, and the drama of on the one hand him being like no the love is real and her possibly actually jujuing him.
Definitely, yeah. And even if she doesn't mean to, we know that these things are agglutinative.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many K dramas, C dramas, J dramas about fox spirits. I've certainly consumed my fair share of them at times, just when I have nothing better to watch, and I'm just like, it's time for a new cute show, like some kind of let's find some drama to watch. And recently I was watching one that was Tale of the Nine-Tail that just came out on Netflix, which is about a male fox spirit who's in love with this girl and everything like that. It's cute. But it's also one of those things like this is such a cultural trope, and the way that we mentioned how were-tigers are like werewolves in terms of how popular they are in China and Southeast Asia. This is definitely like a primordial concept of witchcraft.
From Liao Jai to J dramas.
Indeed, indeed. And in areas of southwestern Japan, one of the first questions asked during the process of arranging a marriage was whether either family was a fox owner, according to Kim. So those accused of being related to fox-owning families were labeled as being on the waruiho, or wrong side, rarely accepted for marriage by non-fox-owning families who saw themselves and articulated themselves explicitly as being on the yoiho, or good side.
Designations of good side and wrong side were not permanent. Bouts of madness could incite a family to accuse a good side neighboring family of owning foxes, as observed by the psychiatrists. When a 17-year-old man began to babble what seemed like nonsense, his father was convinced that the neighbor had unleashed foxes on him. Shimamura reported that the afflicted man was said to have declared,
I am a fox from the time of the siege of Osaka. My name is Owasa. I'm 360 years old. My parents are 500 years old.
The father then initiated a village-wide debate about the status of the neighbouring family, gathering supporters to try and banish the allegedly fox-hunting neighbour. In the end, the neighbours were allowed to remain after signing a bond document in which they agreed not to unleash their foxes. It is possible that some prior friction between the two families incited one to accuse its owner of fox ownership. Whether a family could successfully attach the stigma of fox ownership to another family could depend on the assessment of the entire village. Accusations of fox ownership, which constituted a form of social discrimination, stuck only with communal agreement.
I hugely fuck with the signed agreement not to unleash the foxes.
Mm-hmm. Like the admission, rather truthful or coerced, is really fantastically interesting because it makes me wonder if through that declaration alone they actually acquired them due to this this virulence of these spirit types intending to uh, congregate around even accusations, becoming themselves true after a point.
Yeah, like remember in it was the 10th episode, right? Super Incantation Bowl, where we talk about like these legalistic framings, like using a demon bowl to divorce you from a demon that was actively cursing you with illness by like divorcing the demon from your body. It's interesting how these legalistic framings are really helpful in formulating petitions, right? But like the fact that like you as you mentioned, like whether it's authentic or whether it was coerced, like that's just what they have to write down to be able to go on. But if a family is desperately trying to prove themselves as not being fox owners, they're not going to necessarily cop to it, right? But
Mhm.
ultimately, so they end up agreeing, saying, you know, we're not going to leash our foxes, and that you know things are going to be settled, and so on. Is so interesting. Like, I don't know, I like the idea of it because it's kind of like, damn, imagine someone approaches you to be like, I will actively not juju you. I will not unleash my familiars. Oh, it's a cool case. I really like this one.
I Yeah, and just to touch briefly again on how these Meiji era legal reforms took precedence over the spiritual beliefs, even from the previous example that we gave, the resolution of the um, situation was brought about by the police and not the priests.
Yeah, exactly. There's another one that I wanted you guys to read. That this time it's about Inugami instead.
Foxes and dog spirits also expressed the resentment and jealousy stirred up among families seeking marriage partners for their children, a social practice through which families and lineages became attached to one another. A 48-year-old woman named Ume in Tokushima Prefecture, afflicted by a dog spirit, spoke of a black-haired woman from a dog spirit-owning household. A public official named Sugiyama had apparently once considered the black-haired woman as a potential spouse, but then had started to court one of Ume's daughters. The black-haired woman had then used a dog spirit to possess Ume, though she would have preferred to attack Sugiyama directly. Which, queen?
This is reminding me of the Demon Bowls episode so much because of the whole divorce trauma.
Oh, yeah. The dog spirit announced that it had indeed tried to bite and kill Sugiyama, but to no avail. In another village in Tokushima, a young woman noticed a pup, or inuko, escape from the folds of her clothes, and immediately thereafter began to experience bouts of spirit possession for over a year. During the third of 5 ritual prayers performed to exorcise the spirit, the dog spirit revealed that it had come from a neighboring house known to be of dog spirit lineage, or Inugami Suji. The mother of the dog spirit owning family was said to be envious of the afflicted woman, whose beauty and health had attracted many suitors. The mother's own 18-year-old daughter, on the other hand, was, and I quote, ugly and of stunted growth. The dog spirit, in a voice of its own, said as much.
I've come from the neighbouring house, and I will stay here until their daughter is married.
During the 5th prayer, the dog spirit spoke once again.
I was told that I cannot return until their daughter is married.
In both accounts, dog spirit owning and fox owning matriarchs are represented as jealous, not because they were being discriminated against as fox owning families, but because their owned daughters were deemed less attractive as potential wives. Fox spirits evocatively mediated the matriarch's struggles to create new kin on behalf of their daughters.
This, I think, is so absolutely fascinating, right? Because you have this understanding that, on the one hand, you have this suspicion that there was someone else there was this woman from the dog owning family that this man was considering marrying. And then because he went for Ume's daughter, right? The dog ended up trying to attack her when she would have preferred for the dog to kill Sugiyama himself because he was first interested in marrying the daughter. And then here in the second version of this kind of a similar account, you have this other situation in which actually the dog spirit is sent in order to ensure the daughter can get married. And this, on the one hand, there's an element of slander to it, right? Like, oh, people who are from these families are ugly and weird and unattractive, as a way to kind of, I guess, probably even sugarcoat the fact that they themselves were so ostracized by these accusations that no one was allowed to marry them. But on the other hand, I think it also goes to a lot of witchcraft stories, right? Of course, of love magic, of sending the familiar out there to kind of like an incubus or a hag, squat on the chest of somebody or give them possession symptoms and so on and send them mad with love or in this case it's not really like seducing them with magic, it's more like they're just bullying them physically until they relent. It's not like they're like straining their their teeth through the panties, with the period blood and everything like that. It's very clearly a kind of less a love magic and more a straight up like comply or die. But then again, it also paints these families that are accused of these things, or whether they really are witch families or not, as jealous and as unattractive and as lacking in the ability to kind of obtain the good things in life without magic, so they resort to magic. And I find that to often be something that you even see in occult circles today, this idea that like, well, did you really earn it if you got it with magic? Well, like, well, yes, of course, the magic is part of the effort process, right?
You still have to send in the well-formatted job application to get the job. It just helps that there's powders in the envelope and candles burning somewhere else.
Yeah, on the master copy of the resume. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the slightest hint of fox ownership could ostracize an entire family permanently, with those who were accused of owning foxes often being forced to leave their communities on pilgrimage, or even in some extreme cases commit suicide. Psychiatrists saw their modernizing attempts as deeply curative. If they could find the psychological explanations for fox possession phenomena, they could also bring what they understood to be a civilization and enlightenment to prefectures that were considered to be economic backwaters, and hopefully even cure patterns of resentment and jealousy between afflicted families and others that were perpetuated into multi-generation feuds. Some villagers were very happy to take these new classifications. One woman from the village of Shobara was so relieved that she had been diagnosed with mental illness instead, as now she felt that she no longer had to spend so much money on expensive exorcisms. As I mentioned before, right? It's one of those things of like this one was just like, oh, finally, okay, it's great. I don't have to go to shrine and pay all this money. Like I can just be someone who's diagnosed with mental illness, and now I can go a completely different path for dealing with that. So she wasn't again invested in the idea that she was possessed by a fox. She just wanted a solution that hopefully was a little lighter on her wallet.
Even in the previous example, we saw a total of 5 exorcism ceremonies to start making any progress.
Yeah, exactly. This was not a one and done issue usually. And this is part of the reason why ritual specialists from the various like incredible diversity and multiplicity of traditions in Japan, right, which were now being more systematized and formalized in the Meiji era by even having people like banning a tradition like Shugendo and having Shugenja or Yamabushi ordained in other Buddhist sects that were considered normative. There was competition between all these sects. There was intra-religious competition for resources, for money, for being hired for performances of rituals, and also for legitimacy, right? For their authority as being like, oh, it was our techniques that cured the fox possession, so we're the more legitimate lineage. But going back to these hereditary families, another term we might encounter for them is tsukimono-suji, which is not limited to foxes, but includes dogs, snakes, and many other kinds of spirit animals. And it's important to know that these stigmas exist to this day. And again, I find it helpful to refer to Kim's work in remembering that even the word tsuki, having to do with attachment, is hugely at play here when we consider why people are encouraged to in no way associate with those who may be from these clans. If you can catch the contagion just by living in the house of a fox owner, or buying their land after they become bankrupt and actually going into their property, or even demolishing it and building a new house, or marrying one of their daughters, or marrying one of the people in their extended family, then certainly the best protective measure is to be completely distant. To avoid the stigma yourself, you must eschew all dealings with the accused. So you get this cycle of poverty that is now being forced on these families right after they had just made some good progress in elevating themselves and their, in their wealth. But also, if someone was just completely normally getting into a better position and fortune, they could be accused of this because of jealousy too, because of their particular profession. So it's one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't situations. Whether you're doing magic or not, you could still very easily incur this accusation. So I think we should discuss then, what are some of the traits of these families? Blacker, again, going back to her, the Katal Pabao, observes that the individuals or families thought to have fox familiars are said to, namely, feed them every day, and this is why the foxes obey them. So the familiar spirit relationship is one that is born of reciprocity and command. And while we have thus far noted the case of families subjected to accusations of fox ownership, which are by far the most common in the sources, it's also important to note that we have examples of individuals being accused of this as well. And interestingly, the geographic range of these two categories of kitsune-tsukai and kitsune-mochi do not seem to overlap. So in the regions that we've already observed, right, in this brief survey, pregnant with these tales of predatory witch families, we do not actually find in those spaces stories of solitary witches who employ a fox or dog or familiar in order to harm their enemies and gain power and wealth. The following is an example that Blacker gives, recorded in the journal Minzokoto Rekishi in 1922 by a Buddhist priest of the Suwa district.
A woman came to him, he writes, complaining that every night she was assailed by deathly feelings of suffocation and waves of inexplicable bodily heat. Suspecting a case of possession, the priest sat her down in front of his household shrine and caused her to recite several powerful prayers. At once, her babbling speech and the convulsive shaking of her clasped hands proclaimed her to be unmistakably in the power of a fox. The priest at once began the mondo, or dialogue, which is one of the standard methods of exorcism.
Who are you?
He asked.
And why are you molesting this woman?
I have nothing against her myself,
replied the fox.
But I am compelled by a certain person to torment her and, if possible, to kill her.
Who is this person?
Demanded the priest.
He is an ascetic,
replied the fox.
Another woman paid him 3 yen to send me on this errand. I am sorry about it, but I have to obey orders if I am to receive my daily food.
The possessed woman, it soon transpired, was the mistress of a certain man whose legal wife had naturally become jealous. She had paid the ascetic to use his power over the fox to have the woman killed.
How did you fall into the power of this man?
The priest asked.
I used to live under a rock on the mountainside.
The fox answered.
One day, the ascetic found me and offered me some delicious fried bean curd if I would go on errands for him. I refused. I wanted nothing to do with the man. But alas, one of my cubs ate the bean curd. From that day, I found myself in his power, forced to obey his commands in return for my daily food.
The priest, after threatening the fox with a portrait of the Emperor Meiji...
Emperor Meiji compels you!
Oh, man.
That's good. I like that.
Portrait of the Emperor Meiji, which reduced it to an abject state of shame and terror, eventually cajoled it into leaving the woman's body by promises of a place in the retinue of the deity Inari. The fox professed itself delighted with the arrangement, promising thereafter to protect the poor woman rather than molest her.
Okay, there is so much going on in this story. One, loving the dialogue, like 100%. I think the dialogue between the possessed person and speaking as the fox, right, and the priest is beautiful. I think it's really, I love the idea that the fox is like, look, I have nothing against her. I don't even know her, but I have to do it because I have to get my bean curd. I gotta get that bag. But interestingly, right, the fox didn't eat the bean curd that the ascetic gave her, right? It was actually one of her cubs. And I think this is really telling that the stickiness, the attachment, right, that we've been talking about this whole episode of the tsuki applies from children to parents, not just from parents to children, right? And in this case, it applies to foxes too. It's not just a human thing. This affective nature, which I love, it's so fundamentally animist, so witchy, right, is directly affecting this fox, which is why the spirit now has to obey the ascetic and become its familiar. We think about, feeding the Eucharist to the toad to gain a familiar and so on, right? This is a perfect case of it.
It's also fantastic in the narrative, going about this strengthening of the government and the emperor throughout this period, and the deification of the emperor himself.
Yeah. Again, he's a divine power now, and certainly one of the ways that as we've seen in the exorcism episode as well as in the episode on incantation bowls, it's something that taking the power of, for example, in terms of Hebrew demon bowls, right? A rabbi that's very powerful in his community, who has spiritual and legal power that are one and the same, can be used to exorcise Liliths and demons. And similarly, you can absolutely use the power of a head of state who is now reincorporated and reestablished at the peak of a celestial hierarchy as a representative of essentially God on earth through a heavenly mandate to exercise spirits, but also I like the resolution in this case, right? We'll upgrade you. We'll elevate your spirit, and now you're going to be a servant of Inari. So you have this idea that actually, yes, you as a spirit may not have started out as one of these celestial heavenly foxes that serve Inari, who are considered to always do good and don't do these kinds of things, don't become the familiars of people, but we can elevate you to that point, and then you won't have to be in the service of the ascetic anymore.
Definitely. It's a really beautiful exorcistic technique, and one that indeed works very well.
There's a similar spell I've seen, Zhao Yu, for intentionally converting mountain immortals essentially from acting out into conducting themselves appropriately in exchange for an opportunity for potential promotion in the future.
Yeah. And of course, I think it's good to also note that I'm going to think about your sudden outburst about the Emperor Meiji. There's a way in which that transfers over to many different kinds of spirit hierarchies, right? Especially as individual spirits struggle to free themselves from the bonds of sorcerers who have essentially enslaved them into their service. Something that will liberate them is the deity that you can place over them, take them in instead, right? Like an even higher celestial power. And I think it's worth noting too is this particular ascetic, he gains power over the fox by finding its lair and tempting it with food. And this is a process that is literally echoed across centuries of these stories. We've been looking at 17th and 18th century and 19th century even stories, in one case 20th century. But this is not a situation that is just from those periods. This is something that was cataloged systematically in those periods, but absolutely predates it by a millennia. And this is a similar formula that you see with lots of different spirits. And there are, of course, also ritualized procedures for gaining a spirit fox familiar of your own. So there's an example that Blacker calls to mind, which is called the Izuna Ho, or Izuna Rite. And there's a much quoted account of this given in the late 17th century work Honsho Shokan.
For this rite, you must find a pregnant vixen in her lair. You feed her and tame her, taking particular care of her at the time when her cubs are born. When the cubs are grown up, the vixen will bring one of them to you and ask you to give it a name. Once you've done this, you'll find that you only have to call the young fox by name for it to come to you in invisible form. Then you can ask it any questions you like on any matter, however secret, and it will always be able to find out the answer for you. Other people cannot see the fox in its invisible form, so when you show them that you know these hidden things, they will all think that you possess divine power.
So there you have it. If you're interested in obtaining a kitsune familiar of your own and becoming a fox owner, that's one way to do it. Very similar to many global traditions of obtaining spirit familiars, right? Is always this case of the animal that is taken from the mother and raised and so on in this way. I was thinking also about basilisk being born of a serpent egg hatched by a hen, or vice versa, depending on the exact cultural context that you look at it. It also echoes some of the techniques that we found on Jason Reed's Fox Magic book. Jason Reed's actually published a great deal on Chinese folk magic, including most recently an edition or translation of the Luban Grimoire, which we highly recommend. I think it's an excellent really monumental work in terms of just like the scope of the translation and absolutely the efficaciousness of those techniques. Huge shout out to Jason.
Yeah, for real, for real.
And he also does a fox magic course that teaches you some of these exact techniques in terms of cultivation of fox venerations in the Chinese tradition specifically, in Southern Maoshan, which is what he practices from the Jasper Lake School, as well as of fox magic more generally that he's learned it and as he understands it. So his Twitter is twitter.com/Chinese magic if you're interested. In modern times, the image of the solitary sorcerer who employs a fox familiar is typically described as a yamabushi. So again, these are the mountain ascetics of Shugendo that we previously described, who is especially associated with the kudai-kitsune, or pipe fox, a small fox spirit able to nimbly live within a pipe. Alternatively, the modern kitsune-tsukai is a kitoshi, or exorcist, which was allowed, essentially has allowed his desire for money to corrupt him, and is therefore relied on witchcraft for personal gain, which slay. On the surface, he may seem like a respectable exorcist, making an honest living by curing people of fox, snake, and ghost possessions, as well as by finding lost things and giving advice on marriage, but actually, it is he who is causing these misfortunes by sending his fox out to curse, just so he can be paid to do the cure when he sweeps in to provide the medicine. And it seems like the ascetic that was, using this fox spirit in the previous story, seems to be one of those characters. Again, a truly transcendent across cultural barriers, right? Situation of somebody who is double dipping on money for magic, right? You send the curse out and then you get paid to remove it. But in either the hereditary familial case or the solitary practitioner case, coming from a witch family or being accused of coming from a witch family, or being someone who contracted a familiar and gained their power just solo by doing a ritual or by finding a fox in the wild, the spirit animal is generally understood as being capable of both physically manifesting and existing entirely as an invisible being that is seen only by their master. They live in the house of their master, receive daily offerings, and obey every command, and they use their powers to curse, vampirize, and possess victims, inflicting all manner of pain, hysteria, and madness. Intriguingly, they also steal valuables and money from the houses of their victims, and then transfer those things to that of their masters, much as in the case of the German Drache, as we mentioned, and the Serbian and Montenegrin Smija Čuvarkuća. And much as in those cases, this is why families accused of dragon and serpent ownership in the Balkans and in Germany are typically the wealthier ones. Because like, how did they get it? It must have been that they stole my familial wealth somehow, or their fertility and the plot of land in the same way.
Yeah, you see the same thing with Bajishan during the Qing Dynasty and the Republican period as well. This idea of Xiao Chai Shen, little wealth god, robbing the neighbors' grains for their kinsmen and so on. You even see actually in the North region sometimes, like in the farms, these little, I guess, shrines where they want them to bless the fields, right? Which, maybe it's for grain storage. Maybe inside the grain storage there's a little shrine. You never know. Obviously, today I think the accusations of wealth theft are a little less typical, but I mean, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, yeah, it was a serious thing to accuse someone of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's also a potential link to ku or gu pots in China, famously constructed by, you place a variety of venomous creatures, snakes, toads, lizards, centipedes, scorpions, caterpillars, golden caterpillars especially, into a pot to basically fight to the death until only one remains. And the victor becomes the familiar spirit of the sorcerer. Their venom is used in killing the enemies through assassination. The spirit is deployed to do the same, slaying victims and enriching the sorcerer through wealth stealing. I hope actually just as I want to do a Drache episode with Ki, I want to do a Goo episode with you, Salt. But I'll leave it at that for now. I'm also aware that Goo is a subject that describes poison in a lot more ways than just this pot technique. But I'll leave it for now, just with the mention that you never actually hear of these spirits being able to possess victims, nor are they anything other than a reptile, insect, or batrachian, which are the major departures from the fox and dog owning families, as we've seen.
Yeah, goo is a intensive subject for sure, and like you said, an umbrella term covering a lot of different categories of Malefica. For the pot, for example, like I said, like it's mostly insects and so on. And then there's the other categories as well, like the 5 poisons, ghost poisons, and so on. Not what you want to be eating for breakfast, that's for sure.
Yeah, indeed. And I think ultimately what I kind of want to leave us off on are some thoughts about the nature of one. And I found it absolutely fascinating how much of this just correlates with global examples that we've seen already. Kind of like the Were Tiger episode made me think so much of like, oh wow, it really is so similar to like different kinds of shape-shifting witches and werewolves and so on. Here, I think we've seen the case of like familiars spirits as well as possession by them, either out of the blue or the way that the fox that possesses you because you killed one of their cubs or because you woke it up from an afternoon nap can also be this, within 5 centuries, uh, suddenly found by an ascetic or a sorcerer who subjugates it and turns it into a familiar, who then makes it their personal, weapon of choice, and then that person gets married and starts a dynasty with another person, who then leads that down into them becoming a fox hunting family. That to me is like pure witchcraft, and we have to contextualize it, right, in the history of these psychiatrists who were going out and doing ethnographic field work, and with the Meiji reforms, and with the growing socioeconomic tensions that were happening in these villages. And we have to associate it with the competition between different kinds of religious specialists who are providing expensive exorcisms and expensive rituals in general just to kind of bless and protect families, and who were competing with each other for authority and for customers and clients. And of course, we have to also contextualize it all within this broader understanding of jealousy and accusations of fox ownership in the landscapes of older families that found themselves impoverished but had deep historical ties to their villages, that were being threatened in these village councils by these upstarting families that were moving in with these new jobs and these new land ownership abilities, and they didn't want to be priced up by them, or they didn't want their way of life to be changed by what they brought in from outside. And so the way to attack the outsider and make sure he can never become an insider is by levy them with this charge that required essentially no proof to validate, and ostracize them to the point of extreme social distancing, necessary excommunication by the community, and even might lead to suicide in some cases. So I see this as a case study in everything that has to do with the danger of magic, the danger of witchcraft, notions of social contagion, notions of spirit contagion, complexities with how to study this material, especially when what happens when someone with a conventional illness is labeled as this is the phenomenon that's happening to them, versus what happens when these things are coterminous, right? They're absolutely, it's true that this person has some symptom that could be exacerbated by spirit phenomena as well. It could have originated from spirit phenomena. It could be nothing to do with spirit phenomena. It just happens to be something. And ultimately, none of us are able to in any way explain what it truly is. But on the one hand, we cannot say that, that's all there is to it. It's all for mental illness, these kinds of possession states. Not only does that rule out and absolutely vindicate, the kind of atheist materialist mindset of like every kind of spirit possession is essentially a social psychodrama. Like when a woman who doesn't have a very high status in her society is possessed by a male ancestor and is able to reassert herself over her husband or over her father, is that just a social drama play for her to gain power in the only way which she knows how, which is this culturally bounded understanding of Zada possession or possession by ancestors in order for her to have some level of agency in this world in her culture? Or is it true that ancestors can also possess people? It's a both. It's not an either or. It's absolutely a both. At least from my perspective, because we're people who ontologically accept the possession and spirits as being real phenomena, but also understand that possession is also culturally coded and mandated, right? There's a reason why spirits learn to adopt particular notions of what possession looks like and reflect it back to communities. And they can also be trained to possess in certain ways that will, inoculate them in certain things that will be recognized, right? So I think this doesn't touch into ways in which spirits can do things the body doesn't know how to do, whether that's extreme feats of strength and inability to feel pain, walking on hot coals and being cut with a blade that isn't able to draw blood or shatters on the skin and so on, or speak languages that the body doesn't know. But it doesn't have to go that far necessarily to be a legitimate possession. And I think that without going into like the theology behind this, because I think that's a little less useful, at the end of the day, people are gonna, understand and incorporate ideas as they will, it's important to note that the material that we have is mostly from one side of things, but we never want to neglect the folklore, nor do we want to neglect how awful it is to be accused by this and how much it can absolutely just be a social weapon. As much as there have been stories of fox owners and fox witches in Japan for centuries before Meiji reforms ever occurred, and these notions were brought in, and notice that those particular stories are much more associated with explicitly witchcraft than necessarily these other kinds of things. It also is a matter as long as people are getting better and as long as they're able to cultivate closer kinship ties, that is something that is immediately healing, right? On the other hand, magic, witchcraft, sorcery, religion are fields that are not necessarily in any way invulnerable to the horrors and infinities are bounded by and heightened by accusations of these kinds of things precisely because of high trust environments. It's not the person that you're accused of witchcraft is never just like some random person that you don't know. It's your mother, it's your mother-in-law, it's your daughter, it's your brother's best friend. It's the people that you're in close contact with. And that's exactly where the intimacy and trust and problems of these kinds of things get most exacerbated. So I am really grateful for you guys for listening along with me. And especially thank you, Key and Salt, for beautifully reading the quotes. What are some of your thoughts on this kind of discussion in terms of what did you kind of like about the whole Fox Familiars situation and what did you find puzzling?
Yeah, thanks for the beautiful conclusion to the episode there. The thing that I found most compelling and just warranting further investigation, further reading for me is like this specifically or like a specific connotation of this tradition of being linked to newfound economic mobility, both upward and downward, and how fundamentally integrated it is into the economic life of the individual, the family, the village, the national government, but also various competing religious traditions and magical traditions, all interacting in this web of who does and does not have a fox and what are they using it for. And at the end of the day, each of those questions being problematized by the sometimes retro causal nature of these accusations granting people foxes.
Yeah, exactly. That's such a good point.
One of the other things that was interesting, the emperor compels you is this, as we touched on at various points throughout the episode, the integration of these new legal frameworks and understandings of the role of a central organizing body in popular folk belief, as perfectly encapsulated by showing a photo of the emperor to the fox spirit.
Yeah, indeed. It's amazing how, on the one hand, that can be a propaganda piece to absolutely restore and reify this particular new notion that was coming in, and it can also just be like, well, shit, that is absolutely the governor. It's one of those things like political magic, right? Like what happens when you hate your king or your mayor or your prime minister or your president, but like the spirits of the land in the capital city absolutely are like, yeah, that's the leader.
Exactly, yeah. Definitely a forthcoming episode.
Yeah, 100%. So there you have it. Witchcraft, familiars. We'll definitely do many more of these episodes. There's so many that I want to do on, I think, not just different kinds of familiars that will recall this episode in the future and different states of possession and traditions of possession. I like that this one blended both. But I also really want to talk in the future about different kinds of animal lore and how it's consistent across the board. And also where they differ, right? I mean, fox spirits in China and Japan and Korea and many other places in East Asia and Southeast Asia are exceptionally diverse. This is the foxes that we've encountered today here are not like the Huxian of the Chumasian tradition, but certainly there are many other kinds of foxes in Japan that would be more similar to this, including the ones that are in service of Inari. And there are many more beyond that. I would love to do a whole thing one day just on kitsune more broadly, and one on Inugami hopefully as well.
Yeah, really looking forward to all of them.
Thank you, thank you. And thank you for listening. Again, you can always follow us on social media, twitter.com/frightfulhowls, patreon.com/thefrightfulhowls, and catch us on our Akashic Records playlist. You can find that on withcunningandcommand.com. That's our main blog, where you can have our services. Get a reading from me, get a nice astrological investigation by Salt, be taught how to scry and how to see spirits, especially the familiars of other people when they're spying on you and you want to be knowing them. Ask Key all about that because he'll teach you to scry without tears. And absolutely, I think for the Akashic Records for today, I was having a hard time trying to pick one because there's so many, but I wanted to match license it apart. So we're gonna go with the Heart Sutra in Japanese. In this case, the version that I'm going by is by the Daihonsan Eiji. And they have a beautiful rendition of it called the Sotoshu Shushogi Hanyashingo Kanokyo.
It's a wonderful pick to conclude this episode.
Mm-hmm.
And the Akashic record for me today is less so spiritual, but trying to match a vibe. Is Fuji by Free Flow Flava.
Hell yeah. Gotta love good free flow flavor. And yet the licenses apart is none other than the Heart Sutra. Key, do you want to give it a try or shall I? Because I've been practicing. Have you been practicing?
I've been practicing a little bit. I think your pronunciation is still much better than mine, so if you want to take it, you are more than welcome to.
All right, you got it. This is the Heart Sutra in Japanese. Kanji Saibo Satsukyojin Hanya Hara Mitaji Shoken Go On Kaiku Do Isaiku Yaku Shari Shi Shiki Fui Ku Fui Shiki Shiki Sokuse Ku Sokuse Shiki Juso Kyo Shiki Yaku Bunyo Se Shari Shi Se Shoho Ku Sofu Shofu Metsufu Ku Fujo Fu Sofu Gen Seko Kuchu Mu Shiki Muju So Gyo Shiki Mugen ni bi Session i Mu Shiki Shoko mi Sokoho Mugen Kai Nai Shi Mu I Shiki Kai Mu Myo Yaku Mu Myo Jin Nai Shi Muro Shi Yaku Muro Shi Jin Mu Kushu Metsudo Mu Shi Yaku Mu Toku I Mu Sho Tokobo Dai Sata E Hanya Hara Mita Ko Shin Mu Kege Ko Mu Kufu Onri Isai Tendo Musoku Gyone Han Sanse Shobutsu E Hanya Hara Mitako Toku Anokutara San Yaku San Bodai Koji Hanya Hara Mita Zedai Jinshu Zedai Myoshu Zemu Joshu Zemu Todo Shu no Jo Isai Kushin Jitsu Fuko Kosetsu Hanya Hara Mita Shu Sokusetsu Shu Watsu Gyate Hara Gyate Haraso Gyate Boji So Aka Hanya Shin